Hello everybody, my name is Dratnos, and I'm back with a look at the Mythic Plus seasonal affix coming out in Season 4 of Battle for Azeroth, which looks like it's probably going to be the last seasonal affix of the expansion, but there might be one more after this. The affix is called Corrupted, and it's pretty intricate. So basically what it does is it adds a special realm that's kind of overlaid on the dungeon that you can't access except with 4 obelisks that are spawned throughout the dungeon. Each of these obelisks is a one-way ticket for your group into the N'Zoth realm, that in the N'Zoth realm, none of the normal enemies are there. So you can basically use it as, it's like a shroud realm or an invisibility realm where you go into there and nothing in the normal realm exists while you're in the N'Zoth realm. But it's only a one-way ticket into the N'Zoth realm. So to get out of the N'Zoth realm, you have to kill a enemy that spawns when you hit the obelisk. So you touch an obelisk, you move to the N'Zoth realm, and it summons a guardian on that obelisk. When you kill that guardian, the guardian's body and the obelisk that spawned it both turn into two-way portals that move in both directions now, into and out of the N'Zoth realm. So here's a map of a Taldazar, for instance, with the obelisks. What you could do is you could go here, right? You could hit this obelisk, and then you could kite the guardian that spawns into Volkal's room. And then you would get a rift that a rift that could send you in or out of the N'Zoth realm, and it would be in Volkal's room and over here at this obelisk. And then what you could do is you could take that rift, go back over here and come out at this obelisk, or later on in the dungeon, you could take another N'Zoth realm, or another obelisk, right? And you could get in the N'Zoth realm, and you could come out at any of the rifts that you've made so far. In practice, I think you're usually going to want to, you're not going to want to spend too much time running around the dungeon, not fighting anything. So I think you're going to want to minimize the, huge cuts across the dungeon to get between these rifts. But it does open up some very interesting skips where you might be able to entirely skip portions of the dungeon that you don't want to fight, and you might not need a rogue. However, you do want to hit all 4 of the obelisks unless you're ready to fight some of these lieutenants with the end boss of the dungeon, because whichever of the lieutenants guarding obelisks you don't kill, you are going to fight when you fight the final boss. They're going to spawn with the last boss, and you're going to have to defeat them. Now, it seems like you might be able to do 1 or 2 of these lieutenants with the last boss, but you probably can't do all 4. So you're probably going to need to get to these obelisks. And if you look, all 4 of these obelisks are in places that, you might not always want to go to, right? Not every group goes to this pack here in Taldazar. This one, usually groups will walk by, although sometimes groups will want to go left, in which case they wouldn't touch this obelisk. This obelisk is basically never, you basically never pull the pack next to this obelisk, so maybe that will be one that you choose to ignore. And then this is an obelisk right next to the mid pack, which is another one that is often not pulled. So again, you might choose to, this might force you to pull some packs that you don't normally pull because you need to be out of combat to use the obelisks. Now, the 4 obelisks are not the same. There are actually 4 specific obelisks: the Cursed Spire, the Entropic Spire, the Defiled Spire, and the Brutal Spire. And they're each guarded by a different enemy. And some of these enemies are more or less brutal than the others. And some of them you might be able to survive with the last boss. But, if an enemy that you don't want to fight with the last boss comes out of this obelisk, the one that you wouldn't normally want to pull, you're going to just have to pull that pack, or maybe you'll be able to shroud around it and access it from the other side. Kind of depends on where these placements are. My guess is that there's going to be 3 different maps for each dungeon, and it's going to rotate on once every week. Each week there's going to be a new map with 3 total patterns, because they've done that with both Beguiling and Infested, so I would expect to see that 3-week rotation return again with Corrupted. So I expect that there will be multiple different places these obelisks can be for each dungeon, some of which might be more or less brutal. But let's talk a little bit about each lieutenant. So the lieutenants have a couple of abilities, and they also have a special ability called Armies of N'Zoth. Each lieutenant has a different Armies of N'Zoth ability also, but they only cast that if you fight them with their obelisk. If you fight them with the last boss, they don't cast Armies of N'Zoth. So this means that it might be better to fight things with the last boss when you can, because you're going to have to deal with less total stuff, right? If you fight things at the obelisk, you have to deal with the lieutenant and their armies, but everything you choose to fight with the last boss, that's 1 fewer armies cast that you have to deal with. So the meta might end up stabilizing at fighting 1 or 2 lieutenants with the last boss. It seems like the more you fight, the kind of more it spirals out of control. You might be able to handle 1 or 2 with the last boss, but as you start trying to fight more, you're going to run out of kicks, you're going to run out of dispels, you're going to run out of just survivability because they do a lot of damage. So let's talk a little bit about some of the adds. The Void Weaver spends most of the time casting. It casts a disease and a curse. So usually groups will have a way to dispel probably one of these, but not both. But neither of these are too problematic. However, when you engage this enemy next to the obelisk, it will summon 5 explosive scarabs that basically explode for a pretty serious poison dot and pretty serious upfront damage also. So this seems like something that you might not want to fight with the obelisk. The explosive scarabs kind of seem worse than these casts. The cast damage doesn't look too bad, and it looks like it's a 3-second cast targeted at a player, so they'll probably have time to use a defensive if they would actually die to it. So my suspicion is that this will be a boss that you'll want to fight at the last boss, and you're not going to want to do at the obelisk all that often, because it looks like these explosive scarabs are actually going to be pretty annoying. Samrek, Beckoner of Chaos, does a Cascading Terror debuff, which is basically like a staggered set of debuffs that will expire at different times on 3 members of the group, and it will fear the people. It will fear each person and anybody close to them for 3 seconds when the debuff expires. So the debuff goes out and it'll be like 4 seconds on one person, 7 seconds on another person, and 10 seconds on a third person, and then you'll just keep having these fears go off. So this will be pretty bad if you're in like a tight space and you have people stacked up with each other. But if not, it's a pretty small effect. This seems like it's probably something worth not fighting with the last boss. Cascading Terror seems like it will add a lot of annoyance during a boss fight, but by itself, it doesn't seem all that bad. So I expect that you're going to want to fight this by its obelisk and not bring it to the last boss. Also because the armies of N'Zoth that this one casts just stack a bleed on the tank, which seems like that can probably be kited, they can probably be CC'd, and as long as this bleed isn't too lethal, then it's probably going to be fine. It seems like just managing this is going to be the hard part of fighting this boss at its obelisk instead of with the last boss. Blood of the Corruptor casts Defiled Ground, which drops void zones underneath the party and itself. And it's a pretty hefty dot here, 60,000 DPS for standing in the Defiled Ground. But you have all the space that you want to move around in the N'Zoth realm. However, you're going to want to be careful because if you're trying to spawn a rift at a specific point, you need to make sure you don't bring the Blood of the Corruptor there too early while you're fighting it, because then you'll have to keep moving it away from there to avoid standing in Defiled Ground, and you might not get the rift where you want it. So this might be one of the trickiest ones to move the rift to the position that you want it to be, because of course all of these turn into rifts in and out of the N'Zoth realm when they die. So that's going to be, I think, one of the interesting parts of this one. It casts Armies of N'Zoth, which summons 5 of these tentacles that are sort of similar to the Gahoon tentacles, where they mind flay a random target, which is a serious slow and a not so serious dot on the target. It's an interruptible channel, but 5 of these is a lot. You only have 5 people in your group, of which usually only like 3 have a kick available. So that's going to be pretty annoying to deal with. So this is another one that you might choose to fight with the last boss if you can deal with the Defiled Ground. It sort of depends on the boss you're fighting. There are some last bosses that you have a bunch of extra space to move around in. But then there are some, like Harlan Suite, where you engage them in like a little corner of the room. And Defiled Ground will be a big problem if you're fighting there. So I think that unless you have like really precise movement to minimize the Defiled Ground spreading, you're probably going to have to fight this one by its obelisk. However, if you can find a way to fight it with the last boss, you're not going to have to deal with these annoying tentacles, and that would be nice. Wrothbreaker of Heroes has 2 abilities, Spirit Breaker and Dark Fury. So it's got a damage taken increase on the tank, and it's got a cast that you can move out of, Dark Fury. It's like an AoE around itself that you run away from the target during. Sorry, not the target, but the boss itself, the mini-boss. Now, the Armies of N'Zoth basically makes Gahoon growths, malicious growths, that don't have very much health, but spread out some area of slow around them. So you can see in this little screenshot here, that is an annoying combo with Dark Fury, right? It's kind of hard to run away from this thing while there's this slowy ground all around it. However, malicious growths seem like kind of the least annoying thing you might have to deal with in the N'Zoth realm, because you can probably just bring this thing away from the place where the malicious growth spawned, and they're rooted, right? They're not going to follow you. So I expect that this will also be a fairly easy one to deal with, and it seems like this is one that you'll probably have the easiest time just fighting and making a rift out of. Probably on last bosses, one problem with fighting this with a boss is that this damage taken increase is going to be a lot worse if you're also fighting something at the same time. So if you're fighting this with the last boss, you're probably going to need to make sure it dies before your tank runs out of defensives, or your tank is going to die, I expect. So that's something to be aware of. Now, One final thing we've learned is that you're going to be able to get the Bwansamdi buff once again, which is once you've depleted the dungeon, you can get a 20% damage and health buff and remove your sated debuff, which is a great change. Adding this once again with Corrupted is excellent, and I hope that this is always in Mythic Plus. It's so nice to be able to finish a depleted dungeon instead of still, like, it's just an awful feeling when you, like, wipe to a boss and now the key is depleted and you still have to defeat that boss, like, in a high tyrannical key. That's a really, really painful experience. And most of the time in Season 2, you could still do it because you just get the Bwansamdi buff and everybody was okay with that. But now in Season 3, people are just, like, hearthing instead. And I don't blame them, right? Like, sometimes it's really, really, really unfortunate. So, pretty cool addition here. My thoughts on this Affix overall, I think that this is pretty exciting. I'm looking forward to this. This looks like it's going to be really interesting. When you see a map like this, there's just so many possibilities, right? Like, which of these obelisks am I going to take? Which of them, where am I going to spawn the rifts? Like, which of these mobs can I fight with the last boss? Probably you'll be able to fight one with the last boss pretty easily, and it will be a challenge to fight two with the last boss, is my expectation. But it's a time saver to do that, right? So you're going to want to fight as many as you can with the last boss. However, then you lose the skips throughout the dungeon that you get with the rifts. Now, it seems like these mobs do give a little bit of count as well. So you might need less total count, like, from the rest of the dungeon, because you're going to get some count from these lieutenants, which is good. But there's kind of there's not really much playing around that because you're going to kill all 4 of them by the end of the dungeon anyway, no matter what your strategy is. So yeah, that's the Corrupted Affix. Looks pretty great. My suspicion is that rogues are, like, people looking at this Affix and thinking that rogues are not going to be important. I don't think that's actually how it's going to work out. I feel like most of the places they could put these, like, most dungeons, there will be at least one Affix that you will want to shroud to, is my guess. And if you have access to rifts in some places, you're going to skip a lot of trash. But you might not, like, have rifts all the places you'd want to have them. Shroud is still going to be a great way to get to and from other places. So I think that rogues are still going to be phenomenal, and I think that you're still going to want them in, like, I think that it's going to be hard to design an optimal route for a dungeon that doesn't feature shrouds still, but maybe there is. Just looking at this map, though, I feel like there are still going to be good shrouds available, even if you can get a rift from each of these obelisks to any point in the dungeon. So that's the Corrupted Affix. Hope you've enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.